They included numerous members of the Security Council. What happens to them now that you're punishing UNESCO? What happens to these countries that also that voted to in this regrettable way that is going to undermine the peace process?
Well, those countries obviously made their own national decisions on this vote. We disagree with them. We made clear that we disagree with them before the vote. We make clear that we disagree with them after the vote. We also make clear here today that we want to continue our relationship with UNESCO, but as we said before this vote, and as we have had to say today, legislative restrictions compel us to withhold our funding now, and that will have an impact on UNESCO.
But going back to what you said in your opening, you said that this was is regrettable, premature, and undermines our shared goal. Whose shared goal? Who shares this goal other than the 13 other countries that voted with you now?
Countries all over the international system share the goal of a Palestinian state in secure borders.
How could they possibly do something that you say is so horrible and detrimental to that process? Yeah. How can you still count on them as sharing this goal?
You'll have to speak to them about why they made the decision that they made. We considered that this was, as I said, regrettable, premature, and undermines the prospect of getting where we want to go. And that's what we're concerned about.
Okay, and how does it undermine, exactly how does it undermine the prospect of where you want to go?
The concern is that it creates tensions when all of us should be concerting our efforts to get the parties back to the table.
The only thing it does is it upsets Israel, and it triggers this law that you said that will require you to stop funding UNESCO. Is there anything else? There's nothing that changes on the ground, is there?
Our concern is that this could exacerbate the environment which we're trying to work through so that the parties will get back to the table.
How exactly does it exacerbate the environment if it changes nothing on the ground, unlike, say, construction of settlements? It changes nothing on the ground. It gives the Palestine membership in UNESCO, which was a body that the U.S. was so unconcerned about for many years that it just wasn't even a member.
Well, I think you know that this administration is committed to UNESCO, rejoined UNESCO, right, wants to see UNESCO's work go forward.
Actually, it was the last administration that rejoined UNESCO, not this one. But I need to have some kind of clarity on how this undermines the peace process, other than the fact that it upsets Israel.
Again, we are trying to get both of these parties back to the table. That's what we've been doing all along. That was the basis for the president's speech in May, basis of the diplomacy that the quartet did through the summer, the basis of the statement that the quartet came out with in September. So in that context, we have been trying to improve the relationship between these parties, improve the environment between them, and we are concerned that we exacerbate tensions with this, and it makes it harder to get the parties back to the table.
Since the talks broke off last September until today, how many times have they met together? With all your effort?
How many times have the parties met?
Yes.
I think you know the answer to that question.
Correct.
It doesn't change the fact that we all are committed to trying.
So how can things get worse than they already are?
Matt, I think you're engaged in a polemic here rather than questions. Saeed, please.
Yes.
You think you're going to get better from the next person?
Go ahead, Saeed.
Yes, Victoria. On the shared values, does that mean that 107 countries you do not share values with?
107 countries made their own decision on this vote. We disagree with that vote, and we disagree with the implications, and we are concerned about the implications, not only for the environment in which we're trying to get these parties back to the table, but also we're concerned about the implications for UNESCO, which is an organization that we support.
Okay. Could you also explain to us how, when you cut off funds to UNESCO, which is 22% of their budget, almost $80 million, how will your membership, what kind of effect or what kind of membership will you have with the organization?
Well, we want to continue working with UNESCO because we believe that UNESCO advances U.S. interests, advances U.S. values, a whole list of programs that UNESCO is responsible for that we support, including literacy training for Afghan police and Army cadets, tsunami early warning, nurturing and protecting journalists across the Middle East and Africa, conducting large-scale teacher training efforts throughout Africa. So we want to continue to work with UNESCO, including remaining on UNESCO's executive board, and we will continue our efforts to try to win re-election to UNESCO's governing board, but we are not going to be able to continue contributing to the budget. And, under UNESCO's rules, if this continues for some 2 years, there could be implications for our membership status.
And finally, do you have any plans to dissuade the Palestinians from replicating what they have done with UNESCO with other UN agencies?
Well, we're certainly making the point directly to the Palestinians and to the voting members of other organizations that we don't see any benefit and we see considerable potential damage if this move is replicated in other UN organizations. Andy?
And you said if this situation continues for 2 years, it could have implications for membership. Does that mean that if the U.S. doesn't fund UNESCO for 2 years, then it gets officially chucked out of the organization? Is that what happens?
Well, it could have implications for our voting rights. Under UNESCO's constitution, a member state will have no vote in the General Conference if it gets more than 2 years in arrears in its contribution. So our actual arrearage status will begin in January.
Okay. And there have been comments that you're hoping to work with Congress to figure out how the U.S. can remain involved in UNESCO's activities. Do you have a roadmap for how this can happen, given that the vote has already taken place? I mean, is there another route by which you can circumvent this restriction, or are you hoping that UNESCO will somehow take the vote back? How can you possibly say that you're going to continue to be involved with them if this funding ban remains in place?
Well, I think what we were talking about is that we now need to have consultations with Congress. We will have those consultations to identify how best we can move forward. As I've said, not paying our dues into these organizations could severely restrict and reduce our ability to influence them, our ability to act within them. And we think this affects U.S. interests. So we need to have conversations with Congress about what options might be available to protect our interests. But I don't want to get ahead of where those conversations might take us.
But can you say that you have identified options that would allow you to protect U.S. interests that you're going to present to Congress?
Well, I think we need to have those conversations with the Congress before we start talking publicly about what the options might be.
Tori, I mean, you could explain this as the U.S. becomes a deadbeat at UNESCO. It's there, but it's not paying its dues. And others say that this overall undermines the influence of the United States. What do you say to that?
I think we're concerned about it. We are very concerned about it, which is why we didn't want it to happen in the first place and why we're concerned about this move being replicated in other UN agencies. And why are we concerned about it? We're concerned about it because UNESCO does things that are valuable to the United States, that represent the best of our values, and that do help advance U.S. interests along the lines that I discussed earlier. So we are concerned about it.
Don't agree with the Congress, then, that passed that rule?
We obviously have to comply with U.S. law. We have to comply with legislative restrictions. That said, we will now have a conversation with the Congress about how we go forward. Arshad?
As you recall, and as we discussed last week, Secretary Clinton in public or in an interview in October said that if this were to cascade to other UN agencies, it could harm U.S. interests, and that therefore she had already begun talking to members of Congress about flexibility that would allow the United States to potentially still participate in organizations like the IAEA or the WHO or FAO, were they to admit the Palestinians. When you, in answer to Andy's question and the other questions about your talks with Congress about where you go next, since the Secretary has already broached this subject, is what you plan to talk to Congress about is some way that the United States could continue funding UNESCO, either by amending the original law or creating waiver authority, finding some kind of a legislative solution that would allow the U.S. government to continue funding UNESCO? Or is that not what you're talking about here?
I think there are a number of ways that this could go, and we need to have those conversations with Congress and see what the Congress might be prepared to support. But I don't want to get ahead of those conversations.
I get that, but the Secretary 3 weeks ago already addressed this, and her comments were public and they're on your website, so I think it's not unreasonable to ask, is that what you're talking about, getting flexibility so you can keep funding UNESCO?
Well, it's certainly one of the options that we will discuss.
To follow up on both Andy and Arshad's point about Congress. The Secretary was before House Foreign Relations last week. Did she have any opportunity to personally press the chairwoman, Ileana Ros-Lehtinen, about this funding issue? Because Ros-Lehtinen has come out and said that she not only supports these restrictions, but that she wants to actually toughen them, if that's even possible, in order to punish the Palestinians for pursuing this. What kind of outreach has the Secretary conducted in order to try to deal with this? And then I have a follow-up.
Well, Roz, she's spoken to a number of members of Congress herself. She's also organized the team to speak to members of Congress about what options we may have here. But again, we have to work with Congress because these are legislative constraints. And so if we're going to move forward in a legislative way, we have to gain their support.
And then in terms of the impact on related organizations, several high-tech and pharmaceutical firms are said to be meeting here at State this afternoon to discuss how the lack of financial support from the U.S. might have an impact on their ability to work in the countries where UNESCO and the WINO have their work being conducted. What more can you tell us about this meeting? How does this affect the Apples, the Googles, the pharmas of the world when they're looking at potentially being shut out of potentially lucrative markets?
Well, Roz, I think you're referring to the meeting that Assistant Secretary for International Organizations Esther Brimmer is having today with representatives from some of the U.S. Majors around the world to explain what the implications of this vote might be for U.S. business abroad. But my understanding is Assistant Secretary Brimmer is particularly going to call their attention to the potential that the Palestinians may now gain admission to the World Intellectual Property Organization. So, and you know, that might have some implications for our ability to work in that organization. And of course, that's a very important organization for companies like the high-tech list that you cited.
And then what do you do? Then what is the U.S. government then telling these companies, which have been extremely concerned about intellectual piracy, dummy drugs, dummy consumer products? Is U.S. business being unfairly impacted because of this legislative restriction, and how can the U.S. government try to resolve it, or rather the executive branch, how can it resolve it so that the business community isn't unduly upset by all this?
Well, obviously she wants to make sure that these companies understand the implications of what has already happened, but also with regard to the intellectual property organization, WIPO, she wants to make sure that companies understand that Palestinian membership in WIPO would trigger similar funding restrictions and could diminish U.S. influence in an organization that's very important to these companies. So, you know, we need to make sure that our companies understand the implications of what's happened and begin that conversation with them.
Would it be fair to suggest that perhaps with this meeting, the State Department is hoping to induce these companies to lobby for a change and easing of these restrictions on UNESCO funding?
I think the stage that we are at is to make sure that our companies understand what may or may not be happening in this circumstance, so that we can open a conversation about how we protect their interests going forward. Saeed,
a quick follow-up on Congress. Representative Kate Granger, chairperson of the subcommittee, said that not only will we cut funding to UNESCO, but other areas in the United Nations. Do you know what she's talking about? What other cutoffs and so on in the offing as a result of that?
Well, obviously I would refer you back to the Congresswoman for clarification on her statement. She may either have been talking about the World Intellectual Property Organization, or she may have been talking about what will happen if this UN agency process cascades.
Back on the WIPO issue, I was just wondering if you'd go a little bit further and explain to us what she's telling the companies would be the effect of a reduced U.S. funding or an eliminated U.S. funding of WIPO. What would that what effect would that practically have on U.S. companies operating overseas? Would it just make the whole